Okay, the channel is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I am Christiana Ellis, and Mike usually introduces
Oh,
himself at this time.
I am Mike Mateen. So
You are ready, correct?
yes, I was actually going to close down things that might distract me and got
Oh,
distracted,
well.
and now I am have done so. So
So yes, tonight we are tackling another pair of movies, and if you didn't hear us choose them last time, the basic concept originally was basically a theme of something easy to watch, something nice, happy feelings, generally looking for something soothing. And we ended up choosing two movies which probably are like that, evoke those feelings for people at our approximate age. And then the bell curve would drop way off after that because that's common, I think, for a lot of people, is that you love the movies that came out at a very specific time for you, and you and I being approximately the same age, um, yeah, it works out that way. So in any case, The Princess Bride and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Do you have one or the other of those that you want to do first?
no,
All
I
right, well,
I've
I
seen them both before, and I watched them both.
just realized I had the Ferris poster bigger than the Princess Bride one in a way that was distracting me. But so let's just go ahead and start with the Princess Bride then. So uh, probably most of anyone watching or listening to this are aware of these two movies, so we don't necessarily have to start from scratch here. But you know what? There's always someone for whom these things are new, right? You could have someone who is younger and just never encountered it, or sometimes people just miss it, and there's nothing to be ashamed of there. So, just the short version, of course, it is a fantasy movie with a framing device wherein a little kid in the modern age, all contemporary as of when the movie was made, played by Fred Savage, who is sick at home, and his grandfather, played by Peter Falk in old age makeup, uh, comes in to read him a story. And this is all coming from the book, because the book by William Goldman, who also wrote the screenplay here, uh, establishes sort of a fake history, whereupon the idea is that there is some real historical novel that has a lot of good stuff in it, but also a lot of like boring parts that wouldn't have been interesting for kids. And so the idea is that supposedly William Goldman's grandfather read him this book, and only years later, when he tried to reread it himself, did he realize that his grandfather had edited out all of the boring parts. And so supposedly he, this book, that the story that he had loved as a kid, was the exciting parts version of this otherwise classic like historical novel. And that was always not true. It's a little bit like how the title card in Fargo says, based on a true story, when it's actually not. But we get the framing device here where we experience the story as this little kid is being read to by his grandfather. And so we get the little bits where he cuts in, and explains things, or they discuss how the story is going so far. But then, of course, we have the main story, which is, a story of pirates and revenge and duels to the death and giants. And it's just lots of fun.
Yes, you
And
did a good job
romance, I guess. I
summarizing the
did
plot.
said that part.
Yeah,
Is
but
this a
yeah,
kissing book?
it is mostly just a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is both of these movies, but certainly The Princess Bride is one of those movies that, for me, I basically just have the whole thing memorized. I
Sure.
don't know how much of it I could literally say word for word without the movie playing, but a significant percentage of it still. And certainly, it's old. It's one of those old familiar feelings watching this movie.
Yeah, I mean it's like a good song, right? Where you don't necessarily can't necessarily like get up and sing the song, but along with the melody, like when you get into that state of recall, you know
Hmm.
all the words. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me in thinking about both of these movies as being similar in some ways with regard to that, in the sense that they're like movies that I watched over and over when I was young, and feel like I have them mostly memorized. It's interesting to me that The Princess Bride I continue to absolutely love, but I mostly love it in the same way that I always have.
Yeah.
Whereas Ferris Bueller's Day Off has morphed for me over the years in a way that I still love, but I just thought it was distinct between these two movies, that I really change how I think about certain aspects of Ferris Bueller compared to Princess Bride.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and I won't get into too much of like my thoughts on that either until we get to like Ferris Bueller, but I
Hmm.
realized I had a lot more, for lack of a better word, like new insight to talk about with having rewatched Ferris Bueller.
Hmm.
Whereas The Princess Bride was just experiencing something I've always enjoyed and enjoying it again,
Yeah.
and just having a lot of fun with it. I realize I've probably seen Princess Bride more recently than Ferris Bueller. I don't know as much as I watched that when I was younger. I don't know that I have watched that very
Mm.
frequently as an adult. Whereas Princess Bride, I have watched as an adult.
Yeah.
You know,
I had watched it just as recently as like within the last 6 months. I had already rewatched it because I bought the Criterion 4K Blu-ray edition, which comes in a little case that looks like a book. It has like the old-fashioned hardcover book binding exterior on it, and it looks like a little storybook. It's a very cool little package there. And so I had bought that last year and rewatched it recently. But, it's one of those movies where you could put it on whenever and I would watch it and be happy. It strikes me that children are known sometimes for picking certain movies and wanting to watch them over and over and over again, right? Like that's kind of almost a cliche thing that kids like to do. And it's often brought up in the context of the parents getting tired of, what do you mean you want to watch Frozen 2 again? But I think part of that all just ties into just this is not like a brand new revolutionary philosophy or something, but I've always kind of thought that it was interesting to look at all of the complexities of human behavior as the sort of push and pull between our desire for novelty and our desire for predictability. Because we frequently want both things, even when they're not compatible, right? And so it's kind of a balance. But when you watch a movie that you love and you've seen it over and over, and it's just always what you want, what is it about, you think, The Princess Bride that makes us not get tired of it when we rewatch it over and over?
an interesting question. I, it's just, I mean, it's one of those movies that just like hits all the right notes somehow, right? Like it just somehow they piece together this masterpiece, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just it's entertaining, it's feel good, it's oh, I like to call it like accessible fantasy, right? Like it's not, over the top. Like you don't have to be a fantasy fan, right? It just happens to take place within this
Right.
type of realm, right? That is a fantasy style realm, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
not, yeah, there are somewhat wait, but they even use like the creatures of this realm in just such a fun way, like the shrieking eels and the ROUSs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not there's not think like there's not dragons and stuff like that, right? Like it's not that
Mm-hmm.
that's not accessible, but that tends to be like a certain genre of fantasy that not everybody is like
Mm-hmm.
into that stuff, right? And that's why I call this like more accessible, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
have to care anything about fantasy, but because it kind of transports you to this other world, it's better than if it was just like taking place in our own normal history, right? Like there's just
Yeah.
something about like it's just like what's the thing called where it's like something's fake but it kind of feels real and usually that's like weird, right? Like it was like
Uncanny?
early what's that?
Uncanny?
Yeah. So it's almost like that but like on the reverse, right? Like it's kind of
Yeah.
nice that it's familiar but there's like this separation like you're almost like
Sure.
dream state, right?
Well,
Like
like one of the things that I think is interesting to consider is like what about it actually makes it fantasy as opposed to just like period adventure, right? Like there's a relatively small number of elements that are overtly fantastical, right? Like ROUSs, rodents of unusual size, are certainly unlikely. Fire swamp, I don't know. The cliffs of insanity are kind of extreme, but like none of those are completely outside the realm of something that could exist in reality, right?
right.
And then, Miracle Max with the miracle pill, like, well, is that was he really actually dead? Well, we hear from Miracle Max he was actually only mostly dead.
Mostly dead.
So,
Yeah, mostly dead.
so like how much of this is actual like magic or anything that really couldn't happen? Very little, really. It's pretty grounded in that way, right?
Yeah.
Which is
That's kind of
not.
what I was trying to
Oh,
describe. Yeah.
sure. But I mean, I think you're also right that it's working with very broad, familiar archetypes, at least, within like Western storytelling, where we understand almost every element as soon as it's introduced. Nothing needs like a lot of exposition. Everything is kind of what it is on its face right away. Like even when we meet Vizini, Fezzik, and Inigo, like right away, even though they're working together, we are shown immediately that Vizini's mean. He's the one that's kind of got this actual plan, and Fezzik and Inigo are nice, and they're kind of just like along for the ride in some ways. Like they're and so like we understand there's not really complexity in their character, which I'm not saying complexity is bad or that I'm just saying it's like every character, as soon as we meet them, we know exactly who they are, and they're not going to surprise us, right?
Right.
I think that that makes everything just, you said accessible, I think earlier, and I think that from a fantasy standpoint, there's like fairy tale elements, there's fantasy elements, there's also lots of stuff that is evoking books more along the lines of like the Count of Monte Cristo or something like that, where it's adventure more than fantasy, even, right? Some of it's very pulpy, but then all of it's filtered through the modern eye, right? Because as much as the gimmick is that it's this really old story, it's actually not, right? It's written with a very sly kind of commentary element to it, which is occasionally made explicit when we literally cut back to the kid and the grandfather in the bedroom. And there, so the whole story is not just the story of Wesley and Buttercup. The whole story is our commentary and our awareness of that story as a story and how we feel about it and how it makes us feel. Like, and I think it's yeah. So I guess I'm not sure I have some like really smart conclusion to draw from all that, but
No, and it also, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, that's a really good description of kind of what I was trying to touch on, right?
mm-hmm.
Is that it's like you describe what I was trying to say by it's like the opposite of like the negative uncanny and more of like the feels
Yeah.
familiar.
Well,
That's a
I
great,
think we're
yeah,
together, kind of drawing some boundaries around this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that like the humor in it just, I mean, obviously like the actors in this portray like they because the humor has a rhythm to it that needs to be done just right.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's why I say it like kind of hit every, it like struck all these chords perfectly. Like it has this, like I said, there's a rhythm, almost a poetry to the humor, right? Like the payoffs on some of the lines,
Mm-hmm.
some of the ways the back and forths like kind of develop and how that goes together, like that banter, like a lot of that banter. Um, and that requires just sort of like a perfect performance and the
Mm-hmm.
casting and the delivery and all of that type of stuff. I mean, like there's obviously like some of the more obvious ones, like the, you know, the inconceivable
Mm-hmm.
line and like how that's like kind of like evolves through until it has the payoff at the very end. But you know, there's
Mm-hmm.
always the like, I do not think that word means what you think it means.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Well,
like there's just
and
like
so
those
much of
pieces, yeah, those little bounces,
yeah,
yeah,
so much of that kind of humor too is really just coming from like the interactions between these characters that they've set up, right? Like there's not very much. There's a few beats here and there, but there aren't really a lot of jokes where they feel like the scene had to be constructed in a certain way in order to set up a joke, right? It all feels very natural and organic to what's happening. With the caveat that you also have the layer of sometimes there's a line of dialogue that almost calls attention to itself as being like more modern. You know what I mean? Like we can imagine that if this actually was a version of this old book where the grandfather is selectively editing out certain parts, there's almost some lines where you can imagine that's his edit, right? Where Prince Humperdinck is, I've got anniversary to plan, my wife to murder, I'm swamped. I just mean it's like that feels more like a more modern line, but it all works in context. There's such a delicate balance in this movie of taking the story seriously, but also like the characters have to take it seriously, but occasionally there's these little subtle winks that it's just like it's kind of an impeccable balance. It seems like it would be very difficult to decide how much of that to include and how much to keep away. You know what I mean? Because you can imagine it becoming just a, everybody's winking at the camera every 15 seconds story, right? But then you could also imagine one where they take it so seriously that nothing really fun happens, and neither of those feel like an improvement to what we got, right?
right, yeah, they all very much there's, and this isn't a bad thing, but there's not a ton of character evolution,
Oh
right?
no,
Like
yeah, it's.
it
I mean,
works because they stay in character,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
right? Like, yeah, like Wesley's become sort of deadpan because he's trying, he's a hopeless romantic for this girl and that
mm-hmm.
he's in love with, which he, when he leans into that, that in the rest of when he's the Dread Pirate Roberts and all that part of stuff, he's very much very, almost stoic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that leads to some of his humor because his humor is all super dry,
Yeah,
and then there's, Inigo who's hell bent on revenge, but yet very friendly and astute of his companions, even though he's
mm-hmm.
a, not like a talented swordsman who can kill anyone. Like he doesn't really like doing it. Like he
Yeah.
just like he does it because that's what he does.
It's like I trained to kill this one guy, and I guess that makes me good at killing, but it's mostly
Right.
just the one guy that I want to kill.
Yeah. But I'm really just a friendly, good-hearted
Mm-hmm.
guy, and that's why I get along with Fezzik, who has like this also has a heart of gold, but is a giant, so he has to smash people with boulders, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
what I do, you know?
Yeah.
And so they're like, and just all of that, how it works together. And, that's why I think probably one of my favorite jokes is super small, but it just, for me, it always captures like how these guys play together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when, their duel, the sword duel at the top of the, is that
Yeah.
the top of Cliffs of
Yeah.
Insanity? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That, the piece where, I mean, obviously the whole, that's why I say like it builds up into this, right? Like there's the whole like, well, I could just let you fall and die, but like, how
Mm-hmm.
sporting is that, right? And he's like, oh,
Right.
very sporting of you, right? And then he gets up there and he's like, no, 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 don't rush yourself, rest up. I want you
Yeah.
to be fully rested when I kill you, and like, so you're
Mm-hmm.
boiling up how these guys how these guys play off of each other, and then in the midst of the duel, there's this part where he says, "Oh man, you're doing so well." And he says, "Ah, but I have he's like, "I have a secret for you." When he starts to get beat, right? He goes,
Mm-hmm.
I am not left-handed. And then
Yeah.
and he switches
Get the
into his
little
right
music
hand.
swell. Yeah.
Yeah, the music swell, and then he starts to take over, and that's going for a while. And then he's got him on the edge, and he go on the edge, and he goes, I have news for you. I am
Mm-hmm.
not left-handed either.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's my favorite joke is that I am not left-handed either, just
Mm-hmm.
because and again, it's not overtly that funny, right? It's just
Right. Yeah. It's not even
well,
really like
yeah,
a joke exactly. It's
yeah,
almost more just it's a silly situation that they're in. One of the things that I was thinking about in context of that scene in particular, partly just because it's a great scene. Like the act, the just the choreography of it is lots of fun. Like I'm not gonna say that it's never been topped on film because I think that's a little bit ridiculous. But it's great, especially given the context of a movie that's not necessarily a ton of action otherwise, right?
right.
And it's just it's very dynamic. They're moving around, they're talking, they're making quips all the way through. But the whole bit of wanting it to be very fair, take your time, I can wait. And then, the whole reveal of, oh, I've actually been concealing my secret power all along is it's something you see a ton in anime, and specifically what's called shonen anime, which is just usually means is like anime for boys, basically, is what that kind of means. But, things like Dragon Ball and those sorts of shows are full of stuff like that. And I can't help but wonder if there is any sort of like a direct connection in there at all, or else it's just maybe similar. Both are drawing from similar influences. You know what I mean? But just this idea that instead of just going ahead and fighting at your best right away and trying to finish it, this idea that you would deliberately conceal your true strength and fight for an extended period, with your non-dominant hand, just for, I don't know, sport or fairness or it's like there's no real like comprehensible logic to it,
Right.
which is part of why it makes it fun. It's a surprise. It's exciting because it means this fight that we've already been watching and liking. It's like now it's going to get even better. It's the push and pull, the drama of the conflict, right? And then we get those bumps, and I think it's just funny that the anime does that so frequently in a lot of any anime that has a lot of like fighting in it. Everyone has third gear, fourth gear, whatever that they switch into. I think I don't actually watch a lot of One Piece, but my understanding is that in One Piece they literally use that terminology to like the gear shift.
Really.
Yeah. But yes, I so one of the things that is interesting to think about when like you and I who've both seen this movie over and over talk about this movie, like I can't help but wonder what it would be like with certain elements to see it fresh. Now, one thing that I have noticed is that I think that the people who love this movie the most tend to be the people who watched it when they were young, right? Doesn't have to be that they're our age and they watched it at the same time that we did when we were young. But like if someone who was young in the early 2000s watched it then, they might like it more. Whereas I've noticed a lot of people who watch it as an adult don't necessarily get into it as much. And
Right.
I think I can understand why that might be. I mean, even it is really it's not a kids movie per se, but it does have kind of that simple story. I mean, like it's expressly a story being told to a little kid in the movie, right? But certain elements like that sword fight, I can't help but wonder if you're watching it not knowing anything and we you don't already know, oh, that's Wesley and everything, like who are you rooting for in that fight? Because Inigo is the one we know already. He's already shown to be likable. He's shown to be fair and sporting against the man of mystery. But Inigo is also working for Vizzini and kidnapping Buttercup, right? So like it's an interesting. I mean, maybe that's the deliberate tension there.
Yeah, I never thought about that because we've always just known it's
Mm-hmm.
Wesley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that there's because I think that sequence and the two that follow are so good. I think even if you didn't know those sequences, I think the primary purpose of that sequence is not that you be rooting for one side of or the other. It's honestly, I think that you are supposed to like both of them.
Or they feel like the mask and the mustache isn't enough for us to not realize that that's Wesley, since we have seen Wesley at the beginning
It's
of the
true. I think there's probably a lot of people would just say, "Oh yeah, that's obviously him."
movie.
I'm bad at that sort of thing, so I cannot guarantee that I would realize that if I
I,
were seeing
I
it for the first time.
I don't think they're deliberately obfuscating that it's Wesley at
Yeah,
that point.
that's true.
You know,
That's a good point.
I think
Um,
it's just the payoff when he says "as you wish" as he's rolling down the
sure.
mountain.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course. Like that's when it's
that's the
revealed, right? Like
confirmation.
confirmed,
Yeah.
right? That's when Buttercup realizes.
Right.
Um,
And I think that as the audience, I think that's probably what's now that I'm kind of thinking through it, because like I said, I hadn't thought about it.
mhm.
So I'm sort of catching up with my thoughts as we're talking. I think that's probably more of the intention is they you're pretty sure that's who that is,
Yeah.
but it's never said it
Mhm.
until he falls down the hill. And when Buttercup realizes is when you're like, okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. And
Not,
I
oh my
think
gosh.
yeah.
Yeah.
We would also, even if we like Inigo, we would be inclined to think that, well, Buttercup's being kidnapped. It seems like this guy's chasing after them. It seems like that's probably like a rescue, right? So I can imagine that. But I feel like, the goal of those sequences where he fights against Inigo and then against Fezzik and then against Vizzini, like he is earning the audience's affection for him, right? Because we
Yes.
know, even if we know he is the farm boy that Buttercup loved, I mean, what have we seen him done? No, nothing really. Like he got her a water jug, and
Yeah.
and and then got
The only
himself
thing he ever
supposedly
said to
killed.
her was as you wish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting and good storytelling that we kind of become reintroduced to that character through watching him prove himself, basically, right?
Yes. Well, and I think it does another piece, which is allows these other characters, which we've enjoyed, right? Because obviously Inigo and Fezzik, and we've already seen them, save her from the eels. We had
Mm-hmm.
the goofy rhyming thing when he was going to bed, and
Yeah.
like
Express
that.
concern that Vizzini is not a good guy.
Yeah. So we're already, like you said, we're building some affinity for them, and the way these scenes play out, we get to maintain that affinity for them, so that when they ultimately become his crew
Mm-hmm.
later, it's supernatural.
Yeah. That is
Not
also
supernaturally,
yeah,
like,
it
but
is.
very naturally.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, I totally got what you meant, and honestly, that is a super shonen anime thing too. The idea that someone is your enemy until you fight them and beat them, and now they're your friend. Like that happens. That's a just it's a trope that just happens over and over again in those anime, and so it just and it works there like it works here. So like I don't again I don't know if there's actually a direct connection there at all, but it works. We like it, you know. So we have a fight where both sides put up a good showing, right? And we believe that they're good at what they're doing, even if they don't win. And so that's why, you know, we leave those scenes still respecting them and liking them, with the exception of Vizzini, who has shown himself to be like he's the evil one that we don't respect. He just needs to be defeated, like, and he's the arrogant one who doesn't respect his opponent, right? Because that's the thing with Inigo and Fezzik is they are both complimentary and respectful and admiring and fair with Wesley, or the Man in the Mask as they know, right? And whereas Vizzini has basically is holding a hostage and it doesn't rush anything, but he's basically he's holding a knife to Buttercup's throat, right? And so that's we don't like him, we don't respect him, we don't want to win him over, we need to defeat him. And yet also Wallace Shawn is so fun in that role. I just rewatched My Dinner with Andre not too long ago. Have you seen that?
It's been a long time.
Yeah. So if people are not familiar with that movie, it is a little indie movie where the whole movie, and I'm not exaggerating, is these two guys having dinner at a restaurant and just talking through the whole thing. And it sounds like it would be hard to make a whole compelling movie of just these two guys talking at the table at a restaurant. And my guess is, yeah, it probably was really hard, and yet they did it. It's really good and interesting, and I think it's really cool. And Wallace Shawn is one of the guys, and also, he wasn't just cast in it; he was like one of the writers, and the two characters in the movie are kind of loosely based on him and the other guy. And so, without making this a discussion about My Dinner with Andre, it's just also got Wallace Shawn at around this time period. So it was kind of fun, and it actually just strikes me as funny too that the three main thing associations I have with Wallace Shawn are this, and My Dinner with Andre, and him voicing T-Rex in the Toy Story movies.
Ah, yes, yeah.
But yes, I think as much as I love the sword fight with Vizzini, I think I've always liked the little battle of wits here the most. Um, this movie is just so quotable, for one. Like all of the dialogue is just written in ways that everybody gets these nice little moments where they get good lines that are read clean and just easy to remember what they say. They speak in very specific ways that are distinct. So a Wesley line doesn't sound like a Vizzini line, so to
Yep.
speak. And just you made one of the classic blunders. Never, only the best known is never get involved in a land war in Asia, but only slightly less popular. Yeah. So in any case, and then it's I've always thought it kind of just interesting that it's as a question that you would only bring up if you've seen this movie for the dozenth time. But do you think at all that there is anything about what Wesley does in that challenge that is like unfair or unsportsmanlike? So is it a question of like it's okay to do that because Vizzini's a bad guy, or do you think it's actually just not unfair at all? It's just a trick against in a battle of wits.
Yeah, I've never really thought that it was unfair. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
guess because that, if he could deceive the answer out of him, like
Hmm.
you could
He
find.
technically doesn't lie. He does not say he only put it in one. It's just implied, right? He
Right,
says, now the game is, where is the poison?
right.
It
And
ends when
so
we
the
both
solution
drink.
could have been there is poison in both. And
Right.
it wouldn't even have necessarily had to have been
Hmm.
that you have this tolerance and you've put this, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
it, you could have set it up for mutually assured destruction so that
Hmm.
she could get away on her own,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and the thing too of like he doesn't say that it's only in one, but he does say the game ends when we both you choose and we both drink.
Right. But there
And
could have
so,
been, like I said, mutually assured destruction. Like he could
sure.
have wanted them both to die and then her to get out of there.
Well, but what the point is not the point is like, is it fair to Vizzini in the sense of like, is this a fair challenge, a fair battle of wits, right? Because he sets up this game of like, you have to guess where the poison is, but it ends when we both drink, right? And so there wasn't a safe one to drink. And it was like he had basically prepared in advance. It's cheating basically that he had. Now, but again, I'm not trying to say, oh, Wesley is in the moral wrong here. It's more just a question of like, when you are talking about doing a battle of wits, it does blur the lines somewhat when you kind of start talking about like, well, what is fair, what's not fair in that regard. Because the whole point is we made a big deal about whether it was fair or not when he's fighting against Fezzik and against Inigo, right? Like they wanted it to be fair. They wanted it to be sportsmanlike, right? Like that was the whole big point they made. And I would argue that the challenge that Wesley makes is not sportsmanlike with Vicini. However, I would also at the same time maybe say that that's okay because he's a bad guy and we don't care. You don't have to be fair with the bad guy.
I think it's fair. I mean, because that is part of the battle of wits is that he implies that there is only one
Mm-hmm.
solution. Whereas, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be that he is able to do that. Although, like you could just as easily see if Wallace Shawn had kind of picked up on the fact that like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, you think you're exceptionally strong, maybe you poison both classes. Not necessarily even
Mm-hmm.
thinking like you built up the tolerance,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
But
he
that
certainly could have even questioned the idea of what if they're both, right? Like
right.
he could have asked that for sure.
But that's almost part of the battle of wits is how you lead the game without actually defining the things is just by the way that you kind of place how you say things, like the
Mm-hmm.
rhetoric that you use is part of a battle of wits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to make it assumed that it is only in one and that the one who drinks it will die and the other one will not,
Yeah.
right? Like there are many other combinations of that. This is one of them, but like I said, there could have easily have been had he been able to discern that he was in love with her and wanted her safe no matter what, he could have then also come to the conclusion that there was poison in both, and he was okay if they
Yeah.
both drank and died, and the game ended with them both dead
Mm-hmm.
because then the captor is at least dead.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like those are ways that the wits could have gone, right? It just
Right.
didn't go that way
Well.
because he did a good job of implying it a certain way
Mm-hmm.
and not giving him anything. The deadpan thing came across great there
Yeah.
because
Well,
he
it
gives
like
nothing.
right because
He says, "You've given me everything."
well, right, because the whole thing that I think is fun to realize is all the stuff that Vizzini goes through talking about, like, oh, you must have studied, and, therefore you know that man is mortal, and all of that stuff. Like, all of that's nonsense. Like, none of that actually reveals anything. What he's trying to do is basically say something that's going to make Wesley react in a way that he can read,
Right.
right? Like, that's the whole point of that whole little speech that he's giving. And Wesley even calls him on it, right? It's like, you're trying to make me give something away, um, and
You've given
Wesley
everything
knows that
away.
it can't work because he has not grasped the idea that it could be something other than one or the other one. And I think one of the fun tropes that you also often get in this kind of storytelling is the idea that evil ultimately defeats itself.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some interesting expressions of that in this because it's not 100%, right? You know, but certainly with Vizzini, even though he's tricked ultimately, not only does Vizzini choose one and then die, right? But he had also tried in his own arrogance to pull one extra little thing where he's like, I'm not only have I decided which one, but I'm going to switch the glasses so that he thinks that I've chosen the wrong one when I'm actually choosing the right one. So like it's just this he is defeated by his own arrogance ultimately because he cannot conceive of the idea that Wesley could be as smart as him. And so but just like tying into that whole question is with Prince Humperdinck, you could say that that's another example of ultimately he's defeated because he's not brave enough to call Wesley's bluff at the end with the whole to the pain sequence, right? And so it is his cowardice that he ultimately backs down. But with Count Rugen, that's a just straight up sword fight to the death, right? So that one is not evil defeating itself as much as just, you know, sometimes you do actually have to fight them.
Yep.
Yeah. Um, I feel like every time it's been more than a couple of months since I've last seen it, I forget how bloody that last fight actually gets. Because
Mm.
because it's you know with a couple of sword strikes in the shoulders and then the dagger to the gut. There's a lot of blood on Inigo's outfit there. That's it's like it's not minor. Like he looks like he's gonna die. I think it's interesting. There's a I think maybe a for given the tone of the story. Otherwise, there's maybe a surprising amount of blood in this movie.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, now that you say that, I'm kind of yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I don't know what else should we talk about with this movie. We could talk about Andre the Giant and just what a incredibly unique, interesting person that was.
Yeah. Know what else other to say? Yeah.
It's one of those things where I think that it's easy when seeing him on screen to not really fully appreciate how big he is. But like the shot that really struck me this time is when Wesley is hanging off his back, and you just look and like Wesley's head is like half the size of Andre's head. It's he's just because he's tall, but he's also just like his proportions, you know, because of his you know genetic condition, whatever that I don't remember the details of it, but yeah, but he's just very striking individual, and I know that behind the scenes. Everyone on the set just absolutely adored him. He was just like a huge, big sweetheart, but also the sort of guy who drank like 3 quarts of vodka every day because just like his body could handle that. Slash, he was self medicating for stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but everyone, you know, whenever you watch these special features, everyone just really, just absolutely adored Andre the Giant. I guess, I mean, you know, other than just kind of going after more and more of these sequences that there's just so many interesting set pieces, right? Because you get, you know, the pit of despair, the you know the fighting through the castle, Miracle Max. So like Miracle Max with Billy Crystal and Carol Kane as his wife in there is great also. But that's another example of a segment that feels like we could imagine that is the grandpa's version of what's happening in those scenes, right?
Right.
Because suddenly, you have Miracle Max talking about, you know what I love, a nice MLT, mutton, lettuce, and tomato. um, and so it's just there's the balance in this movie is really unlike anything else I can think of in the sense of trying to weigh that the fantastical or the fairy tale elements of this story against that modern sensibility, and it's kind of a one of a kind movie in that way, I think.
It is. It's an incredibly one of a kind movie. Yeah.
If we I was just trying, we say that I'm trying to suddenly put myself on the spot. It's like, can I think of another movie that's even approximately comparable? The movie that I think maybe comes the closest without quite getting there is maybe Stardust, which, has the Neil Gaiman association, which isn't as fun to think about these days. But that movie maybe is shooting for the same kind of tone.
Arts.
Hmm?
I'm trying to remember what that is.
Oh, it's got Claire Danes and Charlie Cox in it, and she's a star that falls to Earth, but now she's a woman, and it's got
Yeah.
yeah. So it's I think it had a lot more attention paid to it, when it came out, and then it kind of has been gradually forgotten. But in any case, perhaps then. Um, so I guess maybe one last note. Have you read the book?
I have not.
I have. I recommend it if folks love the movie. I recommend reading the book. It's got additional stuff in it. Some of it that is nice little sort of supplemental material. Like it goes well with knowing the movie, I think. But for example, there's just extra stuff like the fact that the Pit of Despair has like four other levels to it, where he has a whole menagerie of different animals that he's hunted, and they get more and more dangerous as you go further down. And Wesley is the one that's on the lowest level of all because he's the most dangerous, that sort of implication. So it has some fun stuff like that. And there's just a lot of the flavor of there's more of that whole idea that this is the exciting parts version of an older book. So I would recommend that if people would be interested. But
Nice.
so are you ready then to move to Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yes.
All right. So I know that you had started to respond to some of what I was saying earlier, but held off because we weren't talking about the movie yet. Do you want to jump right in?
So my first observation was how much this movie resembles Home Alone from like, and I started to pick up on it in the like early monologue when he's in the shower and he's
Mm-hmm.
like making the mohawk with the shampoo,
Mm-hmm.
which also happens in Home Alone, right? And there's just so many beats of like how like it's not obviously the storyline isn't the same, the
Mm-hmm.
characters aren't the same, but there are so many of just the John Hughes things that like they're just sequenced the same way. And I'm trying to think
Mm-hmm.
of what the other really obvious one was.
Well, like some of his stuff with his various little Rube Goldberg gizmos to fake being
Yeah.
sick feel a little bit like some of
That was another part of it
Kevin's
where it's
traps
like,
in Home Alone.
yeah, exactly. Like where this would be ridiculous, except that like we just buy that this is the case,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this is not how this scene would actually play out. It's sort of a kid's fantasy of how you could do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? But this would never work, right? Just like in Home Alone. That's another big one. Um, God, there's a shot. I forgot. Probably should have written it down in my notes, but I wasn't really big on taking notes during these movies.
Sure.
But there was one where I was like, man, that is like a shot straight out of Home Alone, and it was later in the movie. I don't remember what it was, but
Hmm.
those are the kind of the two for sure.
Yeah.
There's just so much where you can see he took like the same concepts and like made it into this younger kid burglar movie, but like used a
Well,
lot of the same
you know,
techniques.
I had not ever connected those two in my head, but I can now actually imagine when they're making Home Alone in 1990 that some of the direction for Kevin could be some Ferris Bueller influence in there. Like he's obviously doing a little kid version, but I think there's some similarity there. I could buy that for sure.
Yeah, I think there was another. So this isn't the one I was thinking of, but there was another one that I noticed is sometimes the way when he puts on like the kind of the farce for adults was very much feels like Kevin when he's like trying when he's talking to the store
Mhm.
owners, things like that. Like there's very much that same like,
Yeah.
do you really believe that I could do, whatever? Like,
There is a speech pattern thing here just in terms of just the way they talk.
yes,
There, some
That's another big one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because there's only a small number of there's not that much of Home Alone that is Kevin kind of talking to the camera, right? But there's some, right? Like there's some notable sequences. It's mostly when he's talking to himself because everybody's gone,
Yeah,
right?
that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think just in the way that Kevin talks compared to the way Ferris talks, I think there's definitely some speech pattern overlap there.
Yeah.
That's an interesting comparison. Um, just on that note, I rewatched Home Alone last year for the first time in a long time. That movie rocks. It's so good. I had forgotten how actually good it is. It's not just a cliche, it's just like actually an extremely solid motion picture.
Yes. I do enjoy it as well.
Mm-hmm. But so in any case, Ferris Bueller. Um,
So that was one thing that
yeah,
really caught me.
sure.
Another one that is why I realized I hadn't watched it very recently
Mm-hmm.
is that the music in the final quote unquote chase scene when they're trying to get back to Ferris's house,
Mm-hmm.
it was different than what I knew it to be, that I actually had to go look it up.
Mm-hmm.
I had always watched it with the like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
being played during the chase scene, like the
Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
oh yeah. Um, that was always played during the chase scene in my memory. And so when I went and looked up, so I was like, did they not like get the rights to it? Like what? That's we. This is weird. And then at the end of the movie, it is in the credit sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back and looked, and it was like there was sort of this combination of it's the syndicated cable versions that use the oh yeah in the chase scene. That is not the song that was originally in the chase scene.
Hmm.
It was a combination of like it was more difficult to get the rights to that song into syndication. This I think it was Simple Minds
Uh,
song,
could be. Sounds right.
and then even once they could, the oh yeah had been so associated with Ferris Bueller that the cable networks left it in because that's what the expectation was.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm watching this, I'm like, what? Like it was just so weird to like, and I was like, man, I don't know that I have watched this movie when it wasn't on syndicated cable. Because I feel like I would have recognized this
Mm-hmm.
before. It is such a dramatic musical separation, right? So it was just
Yeah.
that was probably the other more interesting
Sorry, I
kind
was
of.
just distracted because I was seeing if I could find the song, and I'm not finding it now.
Okay, fine.
Um,
You can start giving your
all right.
rundown.
Well, so yeah. That's an interesting element because sometimes you can just have what they call the Mandela effect situation with those sorts of things where you kind of remember it a certain way but it really kind of wasn't ever like that, but having it actually be different on the cable version is interesting. It also just kind of reminds me of having watched the Blues Brothers over and over and over again on VHS.
The English Beat March is the name of the band, not
Okay.
Simple. March of the Bullheads is the song, but either way,
Sure.
same.
So, but having watched the Blues Brothers over and over on a taped VHS, and then switching to DVD where it had the digital restored soundtrack, is like, even though from an audio quality standpoint, maybe you'd say that the DVD version was objectively, quote, better, like clearer, just the fact that it sounded so different than what was in my head, it was kind of off putting in a way.
Right.
But in any case, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a movie that, as I spoke to at the beginning, is one that I've really evolved with over the years, and I continue to love it. In part because I can see that change in myself, right? Like the movie hasn't changed, but I see new things in it because I've changed. And when I watched it as a little kid and loved it, it was because Ferris was so cool. He gets away with everything. He does all these funny things. He's so smart. He's like the wily trickster god. He gets to get away with everything and do all this cool stuff, and everything works out in his favor. And that was cool, right? But then as you get older and you learn a little bit more about storytelling and you get a little bit more empathetic, you start recognizing, you know, the person who's really the protagonist from any kind of a literary standpoint in this movie is not Ferris, who does not change, but Cameron. Because Cameron is the one who's stuck and, you know, not faking being sick so much as kind of being kind of a hypochondriac about it, like he's depressed is really what he is. And his arc of feeling depressed for a variety of reasons, but one of those is, to a degree, the fact that Ferris seems to have it all figured out and he feels like a failure in comparison, which is not entirely, like, that's not all of what's going on, because Ferris also plays the role of getting him out of his house, for one, right?
Right.
So, like, Ferris is the one that kicks things off, so you can't just blame Ferris for that. But a big part of the two prongs of Cameron's arc here are A, having to recognize he's not Ferris because nobody's Ferris.
Right.
Nobody's actually like that. And even if you encounter someone who seems to be like that, you can't like dump on yourself because you're not this strange, incredible fairy creature who gets everything he ever wants. You have to kind of live your own life. And then that kind of dovetails too to him being willing to stand up for himself to his dad, who we never see, right? We get such a picture of who Cameron's dad is just, through discussion and the fact that that house, that Frank Lloyd Wright house that they've decided is the Cameron Fry garage, family garage. But so you get that incredible, and you have two different characters because you also have Jeannie having that same realization, right? That she spends so much of the movie angry that Ferris keeps getting away with everything and everybody loves him so much, and it's like, why is that's not fair? But at the same time, by the end, kind of recognizing like, what are you going to do? Like, you're just going to sit around being angry your whole life because something wasn't fair? Like, how does that help you? It doesn't. And I kind of adore the choice of having that lesson come from the mouth of Charlie Sheen in that makeup and outfit. It's just such a fun way to sort of verbalize that lesson that she needs. And so for her to for her and for Cameron to both have that joint realization that like Ferris is not even really like a person as depicted in this movie, right? Like he is more like a trickster spirit, right? Everything works out for the most part, right? Like there's a few things where he does, like especially I think it's really important. Uh, I've seen some people talk about this movie implying that Ferris is like a bad person. And I think that's an overstatement. I think he is largely amoral, but he does care about his friends. He is trying to help Cameron. And when the car flies out of the garage, he is there trying to tell Cameron, it's like, no, tell him I did it. He hates me anyway. You don't want this. You don't want this much heat. And then Cameron insists, right? So it's, Ferris is not just, waltzing through life, leaving chaos in his wake and not caring what happens to anyone, right? Like, but at the same time, he does feel like he just lives on a different phase of reality than everybody else.
Well, and I think I've always felt like one of the most critical scenes for me, like understanding this movie,
Mm-hmm.
and just bear me with me on this, and I'll get
Sure.
quiet, is when he ends up singing on the float,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the first time that it's like so divorced from reality
Mm-hmm.
and treated with the same deadpan, like, oh, well, of course Ferris can sing on the float in the parade.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, okay, we're not supposed to take this guy seriously. Like, he's not a bad guy. He's not a good guy. He's not a
Mm-hmm.
real guy. Like,
Yeah.
he is the MacGuffin that like moves the story along.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, that's the one. Like that break is always been for me, and like I said, and the way the other characters treat it, like this is a normal course of events,
Mm-hmm.
is like, okay, like you can't take any of this. You cannot take this seriously. You can't argue for his morality, his
Mm-hmm.
goodness, his badness. Like he's not a real character.
Right. He
You know?
really feels like a folktale hero,
Yeah.
right? And there's all the little details, like when they spot him on the parade float, Sloane and Cameron go to try to go to him, and while he's standing there on the parade float singing, there's police turning Cameron and Sloane away. So it's not like they haven't noticed, but it's just like he's invisible to them,
Yeah.
to authority figures. Um, but then I also sent you a meme, and I was watching this movie that I had seen that was talking about this progression of when you're young, you identify with Ferris, and then when you're a little older, you identify with Cameron, and then the joke of the meme was, and then when you're an adult, you identify with Rooney, and I think there's something to that, but for one, we can go ahead and say scandal noted regarding the presence of Jeffrey Jones in this movie, because he's done some stuff that is why he's not in Hollywood anymore. But in this movie, though, Rooney as a character he is I think what Jeannie would be if she hadn't gotten her lesson learned, right? Like he's the one who has set his entire sense of self-worth on being better than the kids in the school, smarter than them, and having control over everything, right? And so that is why he cannot abide Ferris. But in a lot of ways that makes him just the he is the folktale foil for the trickster archetype, right? He is this is he is Elmer Fudd to Ferris's Bugs Bunny. That's the dynamic happening here.
Yep.
um, and so he, his motivation throughout the movie is basically just like I he's getting away with something and he shouldn't be allowed to get away with it, and I have to catch him to prove it. But of course, he becomes so obsessed with that that he causes all sorts of trouble for himself, which is the lesson of the movie in some respects. You have from multiple sources this idea that the true lesson of this story is not that you should be like Ferris and get away with everything. The true lesson is that nobody else can do that. Ferris is unique in some supernatural way that allows him to get away with all of these things. And the true lesson is that if you want a happy life, you cannot set that as your goalpost. You have to understand that, there's always going to seem like there's someone in your life who is got it all figured out and they can do whatever they want and they get anything they want and everything always goes their way. But the truth is, almost certainly in real life, if you think you know a Ferris Bueller, the truth is actually that they aren't like that at all. You just only see that side of them. But you need to instead find a way to live your own life and not base it on comparing yourself to someone else who seems like they're doing better than you.
Right.
And I think that even though it's a subtext lesson in some ways, even though it's kind of made explicit in some respects, but I feel like that's a lesson that is more useful to me than anything in Breakfast Club, say.
Yeah.
I mean, this
I'm
is not to dump on Breakfast Club. We watched that movie for this show and liked it, but still.
yeah. I have always liked as simplistic as the kind of summation of Breakfast Club is, it is always really resonated with
Yeah.
me. We're all a little bit of some of these things,
Mm-hmm.
that nobody is just that. Nobody is just that. These categories that we've put ourselves into is not
Yeah.
real. I love that. Even
Yeah.
even like
And
I
it's
said,
fair.
even as
I'm
trite as it feels in Breakfast Club, it is super
sure.
resonant to me.
Oh, yeah. No,
Um,
and I'm not trying to diminish that either.
yeah. That being said, yeah, no, I think you're right. Like you know, and not to get into too huge of a tangent or anything, but it's almost like, you know, social media,
Yeah.
right? These days where you're watching a curated version of somebody's life
Mm-hmm.
on a platform that's designed to make you consume, so wants you to feel like you're lacking something that you can fulfill by purchasing something. Like and
Mm-hmm.
and, and those things aren't necessarily in the same post, but the curation of the post is to basically make you feel like you are lacking.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know?
Like, and
And
yeah, so
yeah, no, I was just say that's what I feel that's a very similar thing that people today face is that, yeah, if you try to hold yourself to that ideal, you will fall short.
yeah.
And
Maybe that's more kind of what I meant when I tried to imply that it's like a more important than the one in Breakfast Club. I think maybe that's not what I mean because I think they're both important, but maybe just that it is something that has only grown more resonant in this age of social media than even it was at the time. And I feel like it could be easy without really looking at that layer of it to just think that this is just a, teenage hijinks movie, right? But I feel like the anyone who reads it that way is really just kind of choosing to overlook where it is clearly stated in the text of this movie, right? Like that it is, that is what this movie is about is Cameron and to lesser extents Jeannie and Rooney either recognizing or not that you can't just compare yourself to the seemingly perfect person or else you'll just drive yourself mad.
yeah, that's why. And just to touch on the genie thing a little bit, one of my favorite moments in the film is super subtle, but it is right. It's that chase scene, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
she's had this realization. She, and then they get to the thing where like she could have sold him out to their mom.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't because she's decided, hey, this is my brother, and I'm kind of got this realization that I'm working through. But yet she still wants to try to get him caught,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
but it's almost like the sporting thing, right? Like the sportsman thing that we were
Yeah,
talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah.
Like It's like if he doesn't get caught, I'm not gonna worry about it, but I'm gonna try to get him
Mm-hmm.
caught, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna make him get caught, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And so her racing to get home before him
Well,
when she could have just pointed him out.
yeah. I think too that I feel like there's a couple of layers there. Like one is I think when she's there with her mom, I think she might have tried. She doesn't want to say there he is and have her not see him,
Right.
right? Because she, her mom has already, indicated a like I'm not listening to you at this point, right? Um, there's a whole lot going on there, but like I feel like she and Rooney both are at the stage where they can't just say something; they have to have proof, right? And that is why ultimately, Jeannie, even though like Rooney catches Ferris outside, Jeannie's able to say, "Oh no, the story is he was walking home from the hospital. You can't prove that's wrong, so tough shit." Like,
Right. She
but
ultimately has Ferris's back,
yeah,
right? Like,
exactly. And I
yeah,
think a big part of it that's interesting is it's one thing for her to want him to get caught by the parents, but no way is she going to let Rooney have him,
right.
especially given their. Well, it is interesting. It is maybe just a minor logic flaw that can be written off to how fast the moment happens, but the whole scene where he's broken into the house and she hears him and they both assume that the other is Ferris and jump out at each other, right? Like Jeannie's a student at the high school too. Presumably she knows who the principal is. But I guess the
You could chalk it up
explanation
to
is,
shock. Yeah.
yeah, the explanation I think is just, yeah, it's such a surprise. It happened so fast she doesn't really get a good look at him.
Yeah.
But then as we discover, she realizes who it must have been later because he leaves his wallet on the kitchen floor.
Yes.
And so there's there's so much I think that this movie is doing that's really interesting and not typical of movies of this genre at the time. For one, Ferris just talking to the camera, like just straight up breaking the fourth wall over and over again, like as a running thing. Um, that's just not something. There's a lot of movies that do that, right? There's only a small handful, and like even some of those bits, like when he's giving the lessons on like how to fake sick symptoms, like there's actually a bit where it's like putting words on the screen as he's listing the steps. Fake a stomach cramp, then lick your palms.
Yep.
And all of that sort of stuff, and there's also just a fair amount of bits in this movie that are just kind of like just sort of silly little comic bits that just don't necessarily play into much of anything, but are just sort of there to be weird, or just to highlight Ferris being this sort of chaotic, anarchic trickster character. Like anytime someone is a little too full of themselves, like the uh, the maitre d, I guess, at the restaurant, for example, they have to be taken down a peg. Uh, just, but like, why are they going to a fancy restaurant? How are they planning to pay? Like, none of that makes any sense. But it doesn't have to. That's not the point.
Right.
But just like the running gags, though, of how widespread the whole Save Ferris thing
Yeah.
gets, principally because it is a building thing to make Jeannie mad. Because like all of that stuff is not even really in the Rooney timeline, right? Like Rooney's stuff doesn't really engage with that. It's not like he's mad about that. That's all for Jeannie.
Yes.
But like even all the like little bits where like Ferris is bored because Cameron hasn't come over yet, so he's like calling people on the payphone at the school and playing with his keyboard and stuff like that. It's like all of that stuff is just sort of like, what is it? Why is this just weird stuff in this movie?
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think as maybe another just piece to comment on here is the cast, because Matthew Broderick is just incredible as this character, right? And I think he really embodies all of these things that we've said about the character so far, just in his performance, in a way that I think have to be very difficult, right? Like, I don't think just any actor could do that, because he's got to sell all of the effortlessly cool bits, but he's also got to sell that he's smart enough to figure those things out, right? And then he's also got to sell the devil may care, nothing bothers me, unflappable attitude, but he's also got to sell that he does actually care about Sloane and Cameron. You know, and
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
and have the charisma
Mm-hmm.
to believe that that's like part of how all this gets along, is that because everybody who's not tied directly to him like looks up to him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can't just say that is happening in the movie. Like he has to pull that off too.
Yeah, yeah, we have to believe it, right?
Yeah.
And that just everyone looking up to me, up to him, just reminds me of the Grace's line. The so that's another just like a funny bit. Well, she's hilarious, but she's mostly just there as extra comic relief to be a comic partner for Rooney in his early scenes, right before he leaves the school. But shoot, where's the? I'm trying to look through the quotes page to say it right. Oh, he's very popular, Ed. The sportos, the motorheads, geeks, sluts, bloods, wastoids, dweebies, dickheads. They all adore him. They think he's a righteous dude. Wow, she's so good. Obviously, she's also great in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles in her one scene, but she has so much fun little business in this too.
Yeah.
Um, do you still want his daytime number? Anyway, so again, without just necessarily like recounting all the bits here, we have here's something that I've never actually looked up. Do you know, like, running a car in reverse would never have taken miles off the odometer, right? Like, that's just not how it works.
No.
So I never actually looked that up. I kind of have always just like, as a kid, I just took it on faith that it only doesn't work because there's a problem somehow. But then as I got a little older and a little more understanding of how that all that works, I was just like, you wouldn't want it to do that though, because that would make it too easy for people to fake that a car is at low mileage. You wouldn't want it to work like that.
It also would not give you an accurate reading of your mileage, because every time you backed out of anywhere, you'd pull mileage off.
Yeah. Right. So I think the plan was always faulty in that regard, right? And I think that that's one instance of Ferris actually like screwing something up, right? Because his explanation for how, that's how we will, get the car back without adding it on. And so the idea that there's so many more miles on it than they thought, like it extends the degree of the problem, but they were always going to have to do something about that, right? Because we get the impression that I don't know. I mean, do we think that Cameron's dad gets more mad about there being more miles on it?
So a couple of things with that. Number one, it's why we don't see Cameron's dad,
Yeah,
because he's built up into something that
right.
no actor could deliver, right? Like,
Hmm. Or that it
number
wouldn't it
two,
wouldn't even be fun to see.
right? If
Yeah,
he truly did deliver on what this
right.
person was supposed to be. And also, that's also part of why we don't see that, is maybe that's just Cameron's perception of it,
Yeah.
because he's never engaged with him. And that's not necessarily Cameron's fault. Like,
Hmm.
dad's fault as well, but like he's a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, the other piece is yes, I think that the way to go with that, right? So the way that this is their perception of him,
Mm-hmm.
yes, their perception would be that because it is one thing to explain that you drove his car to go pick up your friend and
Mm-hmm.
go to a baseball game.
Yeah.
It is a completely other thing to say that you managed to put on an entire joyride's worth of miles in one day, right?
Yeah.
Because
I
the
suppose
case,
that's true.
yeah.
Yeah.
The explanation of your intent
Mm-hmm.
is much different,
I
right?
think I think maybe where I was coming at it from, I think you're right that there is actually a meaningful degree of separation between those things. But I think where I was coming from is that it was almost more just like in the like the fairy tale mode, right? Of like you either broke the rule or you don't, and if in the punishment is extreme regardless of whether what degree the rule was broken. You're either okay or you're not okay, right? And so I think that that is the mindset that they kind of have going into it anyway. But I think it also just highlights, and we see again, like when Ferris notes how many more miles there are on it, like he understands, oh, this is bad. This is even harder to explain or to deal with. And so like Ferris isn't perfect, right? Like he doesn't actually get everything, but it's almost the exception that proves the rule, though. I feel like I was building to something else there, and I don't remember where I went with it. But in any case, though, I remain whenever I watch this really moved by Cameron's arc in this movie. Like even from the beginning, just knowing where it goes, like the bit where Ferris is sitting in the lounge chair, just saying, "I'll bet you he's sitting in his car right now, debating whether or not to come over." And then we see Cameron doing that, but just it really resonates with me, that sort of mood of like he wants to go, but he doesn't want to go. Is Ferris peer pressuring him or giving him permission, that sort of thing. Um, I have heard people talk, I think mostly in jest, about a read of this movie where Ferris isn't even real. Like he's literally like Cameron's imaginary friend. And I think obviously you can't actually read the whole movie that way because there's plenty of like just like that it doesn't make sense with the Genie storyline or the Rooney storyline, right?
Burns. Yeah.
Yeah, so like but it's an interesting way to think about Cameron's storyline, right? Like if we imagine, what if all of that other stuff is just somehow Cameron's imagination of what all that is happening? Where if we imagine only Cameron's scenes and then everything else that happens is just what he assumes must happen. Um, I think it's kind of maybe a little bit fun to think about, but I don't know that you're going to get very much juice from the squeeze there, only because it's so clearly not what the movie's actually trying to say.
No, but it's interesting to think about because it does give the point of like it being truly
Mm-hmm.
Cameron's
Right.
art that we're looking at, right? And
Mm-hmm.
his ability to take agency over his own life, you know, you if you read it in the imaginary friend way, it's that he was always giving it away to this, but like in the movie,
Mm-hmm.
he's giving all he to your point, it's like he's waiting for permission from Ferris
Mm-hmm.
to do things he wants to do as more than peer pressure. And then finally he stands at the end and says, like, no, like I made the decision to
Mm-hmm.
come do this, right? Whether you yes,
I
you
could have
called me,
stopped you. Yeah.
I could have stopped you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he says. I could have stopped you. He could have stopped him and he
Mm-hmm.
never did. And
Yeah.
for him to accept that agency and say, no, like, you didn't do this to me.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to take the fall for me. Like,
Yeah. One maybe additional thing we ought to touch on a little bit is Sloane, because I think in the most superficial read of the movie, where you're just seeing the whole movie as teen hijinks, it's easy to maybe write her character off as not being very much of anything. You know what I mean? Like she's kind of there, but she's not really doing very much.
yeah,
But I think with the read of Cameron being the actual protagonist, I think she is really important to be there because she is another witness of what Ferris is that Cameron can talk to and confide in. Like both the scene, where at the stock exchange and then at after the parade, where they're talking together, and I think that there's a shared understanding and a seeing of each other in both of them realizing that Ferris is just on a different phase of existence, and you can't be there with him. You can enjoy and watch from a distance, but that's kind of that's all you can do. And it's interesting because, like, for example, the idea that Ferris suggesting to Sloane, "Oh, let's go get married, like today." Like, I'm serious, and he tells us later to the camera that he did mean it, but I think she rightly understands that, like, you can't really take anything he says seriously. Like, it doesn't matter if he means it because he's not functioning on real world, you know, uh, cause and effect. And I think she probably, so I think it's interesting that her primary function in the story, even though it would seem in the A plot like she doesn't do very much except just kind of tag along, I think in the version of the story where Cameron is the POV character or the primary protagonist, she is really important to be someone else who can agree with him about how crazy Ferris is. Like, and you would miss that character if she wasn't there.
yeah. And I was gonna say, I think her most important scene is that marriage scene because,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's Ferris just trying to do his thing, right? Like, we're
Yeah.
just gonna just do what we feel like, like the id, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm totally into you. Like I can just extrapolate that to the rest of our lives, kids, all this kind of stuff. And her being
Mm-hmm.
like, no, like pump the brakes. Like, I'm enjoying this, but like
Mm-hmm.
this that's not reality. And like I'm not going to engage on that, right? And I think that's important
Mm-hmm.
because based on the rest of the things Ferris does, like you could very well see where that could have been a thing that happened on his day off, is
Mm-hmm.
that he and his girlfriend got married, you know?
Yeah.
And she's the one that stops it to the point later of Cameron being like, I could have stopped you. Like that's Sloane stopping
Mm-hmm.
that whole thing without, you know, blowing up their relationship or anything. She's just like, no, this is silly. Like let's just
Yeah.
keep going through our day, you know, like
One of the other things that I've sometimes seen people talk about is the idea of really wanting to like forecast into the future of like how does Ferris Bueller actually grow up? Like what does adult Ferris Bueller look like? And that sort of shrug reaction has kind of always been my take too, just in the sense that I don't think it's an unreasonable question to ask or to think about, but like for me, he's not a real person, and I don't even just mean in the sense that obviously we're watching a movie, it's fictional, it's a made up story. I mean, he exists in the story fundamentally as someone who is not really conventionally human. And so to assume that he is just going to grow into some kind of adult and become a high school principal or something like that, um, why would he? Like, why wouldn't he? I feel like Ferris Bueller would somehow have morphed into some other version of himself still in high school. It's like he's an influencer now or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's I think it just really ties into my favorite. again, I'm not saying this is literally true within the story, but it feels to me, he feels like when you tell folklore or myths or fables and stuff like that, right? Like he is that kind of character and not a normal person. And so, in that way, it's hard for me to imagine him growing up and becoming something else because he is so definitively what he is, right? Like that is what he is. He couldn't be something else. Not sure, as depicted, that he has the capacity to be anything else. And that's
And
not bad. It's just, again, it's not quite human.
no, and it's not, and that's part of the beauty of telling stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that you can leave them in the confines of the story. Like, it doesn't, you
I just,
know,
feels like Greek myth or something. It's like a demigod. So you're telling a story about Hercules or something, and you say, "Well, what is Hercules like as an old man?" It's like, well,
who cares?
who cares? That's not the point of the story. Yeah.
No, and I think like there's books where like they've felt the need to do that,
Hmm.
and sometimes it's earned and it
Yeah.
makes sense, like, but it still feels kind of weird, like, like Harry Potter, right? Like it had to end with like how they all turned out, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like, is this necessary? Like,
Yeah.
I guess like we've been so invested and we have watched them grow over this time period. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this one is okay, but it's like Lord of the Rings, right? Like it that's kind of like that's like the definitive the other way of like, well, now we go to the gray ships because like this was what we were here to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're done, you
Yeah.
know? And yeah, so I don't feel like there's any need if it's not part of what the story is trying to tell us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
anyway,
So in any case, what fun to rewatch some of these classics. At least for me, I have seen both of these movies dozens of times.
yep.
Um, but so let's talk about what comes next. So I had proposed a sort of a vague concept that wasn't really like nailed down exactly, but I had a
That's why
handful
my
of,
answer was kind of a joke.
well, I
Because it
mean,
kind of fit your vague concept.
it did. Well, see, so yeah, so I had basically a handful of movies that I was like, well, what's a concept that could kind of vaguely group these things together? And so what a couple of those movies that I had thought about were like Kung Fu Hustle is a movie that I love and think of as kind of like part of like a micro genre of like comedic martial arts movies. Um, but I really like it. And so, when I was saying comedic martial arts, you suggested Kung Fu Panda, which I actually remember liking quite a bit and haven't watched in a long time. So I don't necessarily hate the idea of revisiting it.
I like Kung Fu Panda,
Yeah. So
and it's a comedic martial arts movie.
yeah. What if we picked one more movie that has Kung Fu something as the title? Kung Fu Panda, Kung Fu Hustle, Kung Fu something else.
I'm good with that.
Have to figure out what other movies would make sense in that regard. I'm not sure there's actually a ton more. Um, let's see, there's a made-for-TV movie just called Kung Fu the Movie.
I don't know
That's
that
the
one.
first. I think that's maybe not the way. Um, well, maybe it doesn't have to literally be start with kung fu, but something kind of in the vein of what? How about this? How about a movie that you and I saw together years ago and really enjoyed, and it has some overlap here? What about Shanghai Noon?
Okay.
And that's Jackie Chan, Owen Wilson, martial arts western with a lot of comedy in it. All right,
Like it.
cool. So, Kung Fu Panda, Kung Fu Hustle, Shanghai Noon. All right, cool.
I will probably actually end up watching because I haven't seen the third Kung Fu Panda, so I may end up
Oh,
watching.
well, do you want to call an audible and just watch the three Kung Fu Panda movies? Aren't there four now?
Thought there
I
were
have
three.
not seen them all. Yeah, there
I've seen
is. The fourth
two.
one came out last year.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to just watch all four Kung Fu Panda movies?
I mean, you wanted to rewatch Kung Fu Hustle, so
Uh, I did.
we should probably do that.
Yeah. Okay, but yes, I think the Kung Fu Panda, the first one. So original plan: Kung Fu Panda, Kung Fu Hustle, uh, Shanghai Noon, but optional. Watch the Kung Fu Panda sequels. All right, cool. So, uh, thank you everybody for listening and or watching, and we will be back to talk about some movies with kung fu and jokes in them. So, uh, enjoy and watch good movies.
Watch good movies.